A pleasant day, my fellow classmates, and especially to our dear subject instructor, Ma'am Jai Marinduque. So, before I proceed to my actual report, let me introduce myself first. Hello, my name is Brendth Constantino from S Education, major in Social Studies, signing in as your reporter for the topic entitled Supply and Demand Functions. So, um, after demand, supply, and also the equilibrium model, we will now jump into what we call the supply and demand functions. So under the supply and demand functions, this report we will describe the both of them, as well as we will discuss the quantity demand and the quantity supplied, as well as the change in demand and change in supply. So in microeconomics, it is also important to know what is the difference between supply and demand. So dahil importante itong supply and demand sa aking lesson, we will now recall about what is the difference between the supply and demand. So without further ado, let's start this presentation. So for the first one, definition of demand and supply. So we will now discuss what is demand. So let me read it first. So demand is an economic principle referring to a consumer's desire to purchase goods and services and willingness to pay a price for a specific good or service. So basically, ang demand mismo, syempre, ito yung mga willingness natin, ito yung gusto natin, ito yung gusto natin bilhin. So for us to be able to satisfy our needs, to satisfy mismo yung gusto nating magamit. And also, in demand, it is also defined as a quantity of good where the consumers will willing to buy or purchased in a particular price. So, ang nangyayari dito sa demand, alam natin na kapag tumaas mismo yung mismong demand natin, ibig sabihin ang rason nun ay dahil bumaba yung presyo. So, sa pagbaba ng presyo, ay dumadami yung mismong nakukonsume natin mga bilihin, consume natin yung mga produktong gusto natin gamitin. So, even though limited man yung budget mo, mapapabili ka ng mas marami kasi you are during that moment na bumaba yung mismong presyo, you are taking that as an advantage. As an advantage na kung saan makakabili ka ng mas marami. Kasi syempre pag tumaas na yun, medyo hindi ka na makakabili ng ganong karami. So, even though limited budget mo, bibili ka ng maraming quantity of goods para sa ganun, masatisfy ka kaagad na habang hindi pa nataas yung presyo, syempre, bibili ka ng mas marami. So, in terms of demand, may tinatawag din tayong inverse relationship. So, kung yung sa kanina, sabi ko, pagtaas ng demand, syempre, bumaba kasi yung presyo. So, dito naman, sa inverse relationship, kapag tumaas mismo yung presyo, syempre, bababa yung demand ng isang tao. Bababa yung mismong pag-consume natin, and syempre sa demand, papasok dito sa inverse relationship, papasok dito kung paano tayo hahanap ng alternative na papatatapat dun sa produktong dapat natin bibilhin. So, hindi naman ibig sabihin na papalitan mo yung produkto na yun na mas maganda, kundi papalitan mo ng mas alternative like substitute, complements, na kung saan will still satisfy you. Will satisfy your needs, pampantatapat mo lang siya. So, in this, if we will look it in a graph, if we place in a graph, so makikita natin yung tinatawag nating dullness where the slope is going downward. So, later on, I will show you under the demand function what is the real graph of this as I will show you the small demonstration about the demand and the demand function, and as well as the supply function. So much for that for the demand. So now, let's move on to the supply. So, supply is defined as the fundamental economic concept that describes the total amount of a specific good or service that is available to consumers. So, when supply of a product, so much for that. So, when it comes to supply is something that when the supply of a product goes up, so the price of a product goes down. So, yung demand for the product can rise. Tumataas siya kasi because yung cost niya ay nawala na. So katulad sa sabi dito, so the price of a product goes down and demand for the product can rise because it's cost loss. So at the some point or the same time, too much of the demand for the product will cause the supply to diminish. So, syempre kapag tumaas masyado yung demand, yung supply nun syempre magdi-diminish, parang liliit, o mga ano tawag dito, mauubos, ganun. Kasi syempre, yung mismong mga yung mga bibili mismo ng produkto na yun, ay sobra-sobra na. So, parang magkukulang na yung sa supply. Pero on the other hand naman, supply is also called as a quantity where the seller or the producer will willing to sell in a particular price. So, for example, as the product or as the price of the goods increases, the seller will sell more quantity of the good because it will increase their profit margin. So and also the production costs or the production cost is fixed for the timing. So, but at the same time, if the prices of that good increases, so he will try to increase. He will try to increase, or as a seller, he will try to increase his relation or his production to get the maximum benefit of it because the profit margin has increased due to the price and and the quantity supplied has a direct relationship. So dito natin makikita yung mismong relationship kung sa kanina sa demand nandun yung relationship ng presyo at ng presyo at ng demandan sa tao. Dito yung presyo at supply. Supply. So, if we will put it in a graph, katulad din sa demand, makikita natin na the slope is going upward. So, later on, I will show you the demonstration, a short video demonstration about what is the slope of the supply and demand, as well as the demand, under the demand and supply function. So much for that as an introduction for as a recall for the demand and supply. So now let us move on to the actual topic. So to formally start this topic, we have what we call. I want to share you these two words under the demand function, which is the substitute and complements. So first up, what is substitute? So a substitute or a substitutable good in economics and consumer theory refers to a product or service that consumers see as essential, the same, or similar enough to another product. So, ang given example ko dito is between the coffee and the tea. So, as we know naman, kahit mga magulang natin, favorite ang coffee and tea. So, even me, so, if kung favorite kong coffee and tea, then, there's instances that the price of the coffee increases. So, ibig sabihin nun, lilipat ako sa tea na kung saan sa tingin ko ay mas mura, ganun. So, ang mangyayari dito is that dahil tumaas yung presyo ng coffee, sorry for that. So, dahil tumaas yung presyo ng coffee, lilipat ka syempre dun sa tea. Pero ang mangyayari dyan, sa pagtaas o sa pag-increase ng price ng isang produkto, yung nilipatan mong produkto naman ay magko-consume ka ng mas marami. Kumbaga sa tingin ko, yung demand mo dun ay mas sosobra. Kasi doon ka na nakafocus, doon ka na nag-rely, at doon ka na rin parang yun yung gusto mong yung gusto mong goods para sa ganun ay hindi na siya yung goods na yun ay will satisfy you kahit paano. So, parang is na alternative goods. Pero, dito sa tea and coffee talaga, so, ang pinagkaiba talaga nila is that kapag pagtaas ng presyo ng tea, ng coffee rather, is that tumataas naman yung consumption mo sa coffee. Diba? So, dahil dun, tinatawag natin silang substitute kasi sa pagtaas ng isang presyo, tapos lumipat ka sa isang produkto, ay tumataas naman yung consumption mo dun sa nilipatan mo yun. Sa isang choice mo na yun. Isang options. So, second, we have what we call complements. So, what is complements? So, complements are goods that are consumed together. When the price of a substitute good decreases, the quantity demanded for that good increases. So, but the demand for the good that is being substitute for decreases. So, Example that I can the example that I can give for this is that between the pen and the refill. So alam nating refill mismong tinta, 'di ba? Sa loob ng isang pen. So ang bakit sila tinatawag na complements kasi syempre ang refill ay part siya ng pen. So in case na o in there's some instances na tumaas ang presyo ng refill, ang mangyayari dito ay magkakaroon ng um, magkakaroon ka ng kaisipan na mag-less ng gagastusin, mag-less ng pag-consume ng refill. So magtitipid ka doon. So ang mangyayari dito ay hindi ka um, sa pag-refill, sa pag-less mo ng paggamit ng pag-consume ng refill ay kailangan mo din mag-less ng paggamit ng pen. So yun yung kaanohan nun kasi kapag tumaas yung presyo ng isang produkto na may kasabay siya, kumbaga may kasama siya dun, is that kailangan mo din mag-consume ng less dun sa isa pang produkto kasi para mag-complement sila. Kaya complement good. So, based on my understanding and based on my prior research, ito yung mismong kumbaga ito yung best example ng when it comes to complement. Sa pagtaas ng isang produkto, ang presyo ng produkto, kailangan mo din mag-consume or kailangan mo din mag-consume ng less dun sa isa pang produkto. So much for that substitute and complements. So now let us move on to the next one, which is describing what is the supply function and demand function. So as we considered ourselves as a consumer or buyer, now we will discuss first what is the demand function. So, and to be followed by the supply function, where the both quantity demand, quantity supply, as well as changing demand and changing supply will be discussed later on. So for now, let us proceed first to the demand function. So, what is the demand function? So let me read it first. So, demand function is what describes a relationship between one variable and its determinants. So, it describes how much quantity of goods is purchased at alternative price of good and related goods, alternative income levels, and alternative values of other variables affecting demand. So, affecting demand. So, pag sinabi natin demand kasi demand lang ay kung ano yung gusto ng isang tao, but hindi natin alam na there's a factor talaga. There's most important factors that encompasses in terms of demand. So, including dyan yung price, yung income, yung taste preference, and of course, the substitutes and complement which I discussed earlier. So dito, may tinatawag tayong ceteris paribus. So what is ceteris paribus? So ceteris paribus meaning to say it is the unchanged, something one thing that unchanged or constant. So for example, if I want to see the effect of the price in the demand, so I will assume that the other factors will be constant, and if ever that I want to see the effect of the income and the demand, so I will assume that other factors except income will be constant. So as simple as that. So in this we have in demand function, we have also we'll encounter the slope or the graph that I will show you later on. So for the next meaning of this demand function, we have demand function is also defined by P is equal to Fx, where P measures the unit price and X measures the number of units of the commodity in question, and is generally characterized as the decreasing function of X. That is, P is equal to F X decreases as X increases. So, basically, ito yung mapapakita ko mamaya in demonstration about the demand function. Makikita nyo yung P is equal, it is the measures for the price, and X will be the quantity demand or yung mismong ng produkto. So, mismong bilang ng produktong inano mo. So much for this. We have the quantity demand and changing demand that I nabanggit ko kanina. So, for the quantity demand, as you can see in the graph, makikita nyo dyan yung mismong price, the quantity, and also the arrow up and arrow down, B, arrow up and arrow down, A, and we have some description of it. So in this, you can see the demand curve which is downward sloping on X. So we have quantity on Y. We have a price now. So if the price is higher, you will consume less quantity of that particular good, right? So, and if the price is lower, you will consume a high quantity of the particular goods. So, but one thing that you need to take note is that the quantity deciding point always moves along the demand curve, and you just have to decide the price. So the quantity will be automatically decided by the demand curve. The quantity deciding point always moves along the demand curve. So if we assume other things to be constant or ceteris paribus, so we assume that demand depends only on prices. So, 'di ba? Lagi nagde-demand yung demand natin lagi na nakadepende sa prices. So, keeping that way, so keeping other factors constant, so and change in quantity demanded. So, we have discussed the first point, what is the quantity demanded na. So, we will now jump into the what we call the changing demand. So you can see talaga na dito to sa may changing demand, if there are changes in demand, due to other factors than price, and then what to do. So, what if the income of the buyer increased or decreases? So, then what will happen to their demand? So, let us see this sa figure na makikita ninyo. So, dito, the demand curve will shift its position. So, makikita ko yung dalawang lines, ba? Why? Because your income has increased. Tumaas yung increase, yung mismong income mo. How now at the same price point, you're able to buy more quantity than before. This increase in quantity is not justified by the price. So price is as the initial point only. But still, the quantity was increased because your income has increased. So dito, kapag tumaas yung mismong yung income, di ba, sweldo is kinikita mo, yung income mo na yun, kinikita mo, kapag tumaas siya, so ibig sabihin, yung pagtaas ng income mo is parang ka-level na ng mismong presyo ng isang produkto. So mas mataas pa doon, syempre you will be able, you will equip yourself to buy more quantity than before kasi mataas na nga yung mismong income mo. So then increase in quantity is not justified by the price. So price is just an initial point only. So dito yung price is the initial point only, but the main thing here is the quantity. As the quantity has increased, it is because your income has also increased. So if makikita din natin on the other hand, if the income of a person change its position, ito yung tinatawag nating shift in demand. Why? So kapag yung other hand, if the income of a person decreases, the demand curve will change its position. So pag bumaba mismo yung income ng isang tao, dun pa lang siya magbabago. Dun pa lang, it is based on my further research lang ha. It is magbabago. So the demand curve will change its position and shift to left or inward. So kung sa kanina, nandun yung mismong position ng dahil tumaas yung income mo and tumaas yung income mo and nakabili ka ng mas marami dahil sa income na yun, yung position niya ay naka-outward which is the D2. So yung if yung income mo naman, if the person decreases their income, the demand curve will change its position. Yun tatawag natin shift in demand or shift in dito natin masasabi na shift in demand kasi nagbago na yung mismong yung demand mo. So ito yung pa-inward na siya. So it is a change in quantity demanded. Magcha-change na siya kasi mas mababa na kasi yung mismong income mo. So ibig sabihin, mas konti na lamang yung mabibili mong goods kasi yun, it is parang limited na rin siya. So but due to price in this, the demand curve does not shift. And here the price is the same. The demand curve shifts to outward because the income of a person has increased. So, basta pagtaas ng income rather, bababa mismo yung mas marami pala yung magiging mabibili mo than before. And yun tinatawag nating shift. Wala pang mga shift and parang pa-outward siya. Pero kapag bumaba mismo yung mismong income mo, ibig sabihin bababa parang parang kokonti na lang yung mabibili mo. So in this, the demand curve shift to outward and the demand will shift to inward kapag may pagpataas ng income mo at pagbaba ng income mo. So next one, we have the supply function. So the supply function is the mathematical expression of the relation between supply and those factors that affect the willingness and ability of a supplier to offer goods or sale. So dito naman, makikita natin yung differences ng also sa demand, meron din tayo dito na changes in supply and demand, changes supply and quantity supplied. So in supply function, we can see here na may sa supply function, we can see here the mathematical expression in which relationship between the supply and those other factors. So, meron dito sa supply, may ibang factors din katulad ng subsidies, sa taxes, and also, cost of production. And there's a difference between the quantity supplied and changing supply as I mentioned earlier. So, in supply function, the price obviously, the cost of production, tax and subsidies given by the government, and like in supply and demand, there's a difference between all of them. So there we have the another example, another definition of supply function. It is defined by P is equal to Fx. P and X, as before, is generally characterized as an increasing function of X. So that is P is equal to Fx increases as X increases. So dito sa supply functions, makikita din natin ito sa isang graph na makikita nyo later on sa isang video. So now, let us proceed to the quantity supplied. So when it comes to supply function, it also have quantity supplied and changing supplied. So now we have quantity supplied. So as you can see in the figure in the slide, you can see that the quantity deciding point is always on the supply curve. It moves along the supply curve, but the supply does not shift. So, di ba nakita nyo, di nag-move siya. So now, what if pagpalagi natin na nagkaroon ng pagbabago sa supply. So due to factors when the price, or for example, what if the cost of production increases or decreases, may pagtaas at pagbaba. So if the cost of production increases or decreases, the supply curve will shift. So, for example, kagaya na lamang ng cost of production ay bumaba. So makikita natin ito sa tinatawag nating the changing supply. So, as you can see in the figure, nag-shift yung mismo supply over to the right. So, why? Because at the same price point, now you're able to produce more or you're able to supply more. So, hence the supply shift to right, supply curve has shifted from S to S1. So, this is called a shift in supply. Now, if the cost of the production increases, then it will shift to left because at the same price point, you are not able to maintain your profit margin and you will reduce your quantity supplied. So, the important thing is that if the demand or supply is changing due to price, then the momentum will be along with those demand or supply curve, and supply and demand curve will not change their position. But if the demand and supply are affected by the factors other than the price, so like income or the cost of production, then the demand and supply curve will change that position and shift to the right or left depending on in what direction and the factors have changed. So, yun yung mismong naka-include na search ko, and also based on my understanding about between the quantity supplied and changing supplied. So now let us proceed to the graph of the supply and demand function that you can see in the video.
Okay, so in this video we will look at the idea of a demand function and of a supply function. So let me split this up into two sides, because we have, as we're about to see, two realities. We have the reality of consumers, and we have the reality of suppliers. Let's look first at the reality of consumers. So what we're interested in is the relationship between the number of units that consumers are willing to purchase, so X, with respect to P, the unit price of a given product. Now, of course, as the price of a product varies, X, the number of units that the consumers are willing to purchase, will vary as well. We will assume here, for simplicity, that we have a linear relationship between P and X. The one thing which is obvious is that it is a negative relationship. As the price decreases, well, consumers are willing to purchase obviously more units of the given product, and so we have a negative relationship. P given as a function of X. The higher the price, the fewer units consumers are willing to purchase, the lower the price, the larger number of units consumers are willing to purchase. So we have a negative relationship between the unit price and the number of units consumers are willing to purchase, and we call this function the demand function. Well, let's look at the same scenario, but now from the perspective of no longer consumers, but of suppliers. Again, we look at the relationship between the price of a single unit, and X now is the number of units that a supplier is willing to, of course, supply to the consumers. P as before is the price of a single unit. And of course, the relationship will be a positive one. Once again, we assume that we have a positive relationship between X and P. Well, if you think about this, the higher the price, the larger number of items are suppliers willing to supply to consumers, are willing to sell. So we have a positive relationship. Let's now say that P is g of X. The highest the selling price, the more units suppliers are willing to sell to consumers. And well, if this is called the demand function, in this case, looking at the suppliers, P equals g of X is called the supply function. So, the demand function is a negative relationship between the price of a single unit and the number of units that consumers are willing to purchase. The supply function is a positive relationship between, once again, the unit price, so the price of a single unit, whatever the product is, and X, the number of units that the suppliers are willing to sell to the consumers. And there's a very important quantity that is related to both the demand function and the supply function, and that is the idea of an equilibrium point. And that's simply looking at the demand function and the supply function in the same graph. So suppose we look now at a unique set of axes, so X and P, and we have the demand function, P equals f of X, a negative relationship between X and P, and the supply function, which is a positive relationship between P and X. There is hopefully a point of intersection between the supply and demand function, and if you think about this point, it is an interesting point. Let me say that x0 is the x value where both supply and demand functions meet, and p0 is the price where, once again, the demand and supply functions both meet. Why is this called an equilibrium point? Well, if you think about this, it's a very intuitive name, because this is the point where a market has reached an equilibrium. For the given price P0, the number of units that consumers are willing to purchase and the number of units that suppliers are willing to sell to consumers is exactly the same. So when you have an equilibrium point, then you've reached a market equilibrium. So every single unit that is being put on the market by suppliers will be purchased by consumers. So there will be absolutely no left over. And that is the idea of a market equilibrium point. And that's it.
So going back into the video, the term of equilibrium point was been mentioned. So here's the meaning of the equilibrium point. So what is the equilibrium point? So the equilibrium point is a condition or state in which economic forces are balanced. So represents That represents a theoretical state of rest where all point of equilibrium economic transactions that should occur given the initial state of all relevant economic variables have taken place. So with this, paano natin makikita mismo kung ano yung bakit sila nag-intersect dahil may equilibrium point na ito. So if we will see, I will go to the graph. So makikita natin dito na nag-intersect sila at na-introduce sa atin yung tinatawag nating equilibrium point sa mismong graph. So with this, in the graph, we have supply curve upward sloping as you can see in the figure, and we have the demand curve downward sloping. So on the axis, we have quantity supplied as well as demanded. So on the x-axis, y-axis rather, we have prices. So when the supply and the demand curve intersect, the point at which the demand and supply curve intersects is called the equilibrium point. So, and at equilibrium point, you get the equilibrium quantity, and also you can get the equilibrium price. So, that will be that will be happened after the demand the demand and the supply curve will intersect to each other. So for the equilibrium price as an equilibrium quantity na nabanggit ko kanina, so what it means by equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, so we can see that at this price, the consumers are willing to buy this much of quantity, or we can also see that at this price, the suppliers are willing to supply this much of quantity. So if the demand is more than the supply and above the equilibrium point or the equilibrium level, the supply is more than the demand. So supply quantity is also more than the demand quantity. But you must take note or must know that equilibrium is a universal truth. So the mismatch between demand and supply may be there a moment for a few times, but sooner or later, the market will come to equilibrium. That will buy a certain quantity that consumers will buy and the producers will sell at a mutual acceptable price. So magkakasundo silang dalawa dahil sa presyo. So sa equilibrium, both buyers and sellers accept the view in price. So that's why equilibrium has reached. Kaya nagre-reach yun kasi nagmi-meet mismo yung mismong kagustuhan, yung mismong nagkakasundo yung buyer at yung mismong sellers to accept the view and price. So, dahil doon, the equilibrium has reached and the quantity demanded equals the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded and the quantity supplied rather. So, this thing you should know, that is the most important thing when it comes to solving the questions on demand and supply. So, you need to remember that quantity demanded is equals to quantity supplied and the equilibrium points. Kasi magkakasundo sila dito. And the price will always, the actual position of demand was a supply. So the question is, what will happen? So what will happen, or what happens if the demand is more than a supply? So here is the thing with this. So people will try to buy more. And if the suppliers see that the people ay bumibili na mas marami, so syempre tataasan nila ng presyo. Tataasan ng presyo that will increase and the supply and demand will reach an equilibrium level. Sa equilibrium point. So, syempre, mas marami bumibili. So, maiisipan ng seller na taasan yung presyo nito. Increase yung, dahil dumadami na nagde-demand eh. So, mas marami na, sa pagdami ng demand, so, kailangan nilang taasan yung presyo. So, dahil dito, makikita natin na yung supply at yung demand ay nag-i-intersect, pupunta o mag-reach papunta sa tinatawag nating equilibrium level, equilibrium point. That's why nagkakaroon ng tinatawag nating equilibrium point. So on the other hand, the quantity supplied is more than the quantity demanded. Suppliers have a lot of stock available with them and people are not buying the product. So what will happen? So syempre mas maraming stock nila, mas marami na stock nilang mga produkto, kailangan nila nitong babaan ng presyo. So para mabili. So hence the price will come down and again the equilibrium condition will be reached. So kung kanina kapag taas yung demand at kailangan nilang mga sellers na isipan nilang itaas yung presyo nito, nagkakasundo. Dito naman kapag yung mga medyo may mga stock sila, ginagawa nila dito, yung mga hindi nabibili ay bababaan na nilang presyo. At dito makikita din natin na nag-intersect or nagre-reach tinatawag nating equilibrium point. So, that's how the demand and supply interact with each other and eventually come to equilibrium. So that will be all for my topic presentation about the supply and demand functions. So I hope you learned something from my report. So once again, I am Brendth Constantino from BS Education, major in Social Studies, signing off as your reporter. Thank you, God bless, and keep safe.